They shaved his hair, but they couldn't tear out his roots. On that rainy morning in Newark, Elijah Baptiste didn't just lose his dreads. He lost a promise made beside a hospital bed, the silent respect earned from fighting invisible wars. He was dragged, humiliated, treated like a threat, even as he carried the honor of a war veteran across his chest. But if they thought they could break him that easily, they made a mistake that would echo through the streets, the courthouses, and the wounded soul of an entire city. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a story of rebirth, and of a vow that not even violence could erase. What happens when they try to destroy someone who already learned to survive in silence? What grows after they cut away everything you once stood for? You're about to find out. An entire city carried invisible scars. Elijah was just one among thousands. But in that cold courtroom, under indifferent eyes and protocols that reeked of decay, he turned shame into resistance. Not with screams, not with revenge, but with something far stronger. Silent faith, and the courage to remain standing when everything around him demanded he kneel. It wasn't just an individual fight. It was the exposure of an entire system, corroded by decades of abuse buried under cold bureaucracies. And every drop of rain hitting the courthouse windows that day seemed to announce that the era of silence was ending. Because sometimes, all it takes to change the world is a single person who refuses to be erased. A root that insists on growing, even through cracked asphalt. This story will leave a mark. It will make you angry, but more than anything, it will remind you, true strength doesn't scream. It blooms in silence. Get ready to meet Elijah Baptiste, and understand why the deepest roots are the ones no one can ever tear away. Take a deep breath, because after this story, you'll never look at silence the same way again. But before listening to this exciting story, if you are not yet subscribed to our channel, subscribe now and become part of our community. The rain began softly, as if the sky were whispering something only it could understand. Inside Elijah Baptiste's small apartment, the steam from his tea rose in quiet spirals, dancing in the air like unspoken prayers. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the worn-out walls. He stood before the hallway mirror, eyes locked on the reflection of his dreads, 3 years of faith, struggle, and memory woven into every strand. His left hand, calloused and steady, gently touched the small wooden crucifix around his neck, while the right adjusted one of the finer braids. His ritual was almost sacred. Hibiscus tea, Psalm 91 whispered in silence, and the memory of cousin Jean-Luc, smiling in the hospital after his final round of chemo. The clock read 6:17 a.m. Elijah grabbed his worn leather wallet, slipped on his weathered military coat over his broad shoulders, and stepped outside. The city was still waking up. Newark, at that early hour, looked like a gray-toned painting. Damp buildings, flickering streetlights, and the sound of tires slicing through the puddles on the asphalt. Elijah was headed to the courthouse, but took a planned detour. He slipped through the back entrance of the Haiti Roots Community Center. "Morning, Major B," whispered one of the staff as he passed by with calm eyes and steady steps. He touched the photo of the center's founders, pinned to the wall, an old picture of Haitians building a wooden structure. Here, he always remembered who he was. By the time he stepped out, the sky had darkened further. Elijah was adjusting the collar of his coat when he heard it, a sharp noise, a muffled cry. Across the street, near the side entrance of the Essex District Courthouse, 2 officers were forcing a young man against the wall. Jamal, one of the center's boys. 17, impulsive, but good-hearted. Elijah crossed the street in 3 long strides, eyes wide, heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, that kid didn't do anything." "I know him," he said, raising his hand in peace. The officers didn't even glance at him. One of them shoved Elijah hard in the chest. "Back off, citizen. This isn't your jurisdiction." Elijah took 2 steps back, but didn't drop his gaze. He opened his wallet and pulled out his federal prosecutor badge. Still, the officer didn't blink. The other officer only gripped Jamal's arm tighter, as the boy tried to fight back tears. "He's not a threat to anyone," Elijah said, voice firm but calm. But at that moment, it wasn't about threats. It was about appearance. about who looked like they deserved respect, or didn't. The rain grew heavier, and with it, something inside Elijah began to shift. Elijah's footsteps echoed firmly across the wet marble floor of the Essex District Courthouse. The ground reflected the sterile overhead lights like a clinical stage, cold, indifferent. The receptionist hesitated when she saw him approach, but said nothing. The silence in that place carried weight. He calmly displayed his credentials, though his chest still carried the tension from the scene with Jamal, the boy's eyes silently pleading for help. Elijah headed toward the triage wing hallway, where temporary detainees were taken before hearings. He needed to know if the kid was okay. But before he could announce himself, a harsh voice barked behind him. "Hold it! ID." He turned slowly. A tall white man with a clenched jaw and an expression carved from authority. Brian Cargill. His black uniform highlighted old medals on his chest and a radio always at the ready on his shoulder. Elijah handed over his identification and calmly explained he was a federal prosecutor and needed information on a recently detained minor. Cargill read the name on the ID, squinted, and let his gaze slide up to Elijah's wet dreads. "You sure you're in the right place?" His tone dripped with contempt. "Your appearance doesn't really match a federal environment." Elijah took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time, but it stung like it was. "I'm a veteran, sir. Served in Kandahar. My name is in the system. I'm cleared to enter." Cargill grabbed his radio, muttered something low, and motioned for two other officers to come closer. "Security check. Standard procedure." Elijah tried to reason, but his arms were already being gripped tightly. "This is abuse of authority," he said, without raising his voice. "I'm a federal prosecutor." Cargill stepped in close, nearly nose to nose. "In here, you're just another guy with gang hair. If you want respect, drop the act." The hallway began to narrow. Other staff glanced away. No one stepped in. Elijah tried to stand his ground, like he'd done so many times on the battlefield. But here, in this courthouse, the enemy didn't wear foreign colors. He wore a domestic badge, backed by institutional silence. "You're violating my rights," Elijah said. His voice trembled, but didn't break. "I have a name, a position, a history." "Don't care about your history," Cargill replied, cold as concrete. "In here, order comes before respect." Elijah was dragged through a side door. No explanation. No record. Only the certainty that something deeply wrong was about to unfold. The room was cold. No windows, no clock, no names. Just light gray concrete walls, a metal chair, and a security camera high in the corner. Elijah entered in handcuffs. There was no formal justification, no warrant, no clear accusation. Cargill stood there, arms crossed, flanked by two younger officers who looked like they followed orders without question. In the center of the room, a trimming machine, not for fingerprints, for hair. Elijah sat down without resistance. He knew what was coming wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. Security protocol. "Nothing personal," said one of the officers, without making eye contact. Cargill said nothing. He just watched. The machine buzzed to life, a low, continuous hum that filled the room. Elijah fixed his gaze on an invisible point ahead. The first lock fell slowly, spinning through the air before hitting the floor. Then another, and another. The dreads that had carried promise, resistance, and faith, stripped away like filth. One black strand clung to the sleeve of his shirt. Elijah looked at it for a moment, and then closed his eyes. No one laughed out loud, but the smiles were there. Small, complicit, twisted. The cut didn't hurt his skin. It hurt his soul. It was as if the story he had woven over the years was being rewritten by indifferent hands. He remembered the first time he braided his hair with Jean-Luc, back in the Miami hospital. He remembered the prayer they shared, the pact sealed with tearful eyes and clasped hands. 3 years. A brother's promise, Jean-Luc had said. Elijah had kept every strand as a living reminder of that silent vow. And now, every strand on the floor felt like an exposed scar. When it was done, One of the officers brushed off his head like he was cleaning a machine. Cargill stepped forward, wearing that same cold, cutting smile. "Now you look like someone who belongs here." Elijah didn't respond, didn't move a muscle. He just stared at the ground. His dreads lay scattered like roots ripped from the earth. There was no blood, but there was loss. There was pain. When he stood up, the wooden crucifix still hung around his neck. The chain had held firm, even as everything else was taken. It was small, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all we need to not lose ourselves completely. The sound of rain hammered against the courthouse roof like a memory that refused to fade. Elijah looked out at those present, attorneys, assistants, defendants, guards, each face carrying its own story, its own scars. Yet, in that moment, he knew the most exposed wound in the room was his. With a steady hand, he called the first case on the docket. The formality of the law became his armor, something he wore expertly even as his heart pounded out of rhythm in his chest. During a pause between cases, a document slipped from the rushed stack of papers. Elijah bent down to retrieve it, and as he flipped through it quickly, his eyes froze on a marked page. Operation Vanguard, 2015. Brian Cargill's name was stamped at the top as the operations leader. The operation that, according to official records, had resulted in the death of a young man named Elijah Baptiste. Rico, his brother. The blood he had sworn to honor and protect, even after the war. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to keep the pain from breaking through. But it was too late. The past surged forward like a violent tide. The news of Rico's death arriving in a rain-soaked envelope. The silent, almost secret burial. The investigation that led nowhere. It all made sense now. Cargill wasn't just today's aggressor. He was the ghost from Elijah's past he had never confronted. Elijah's hand trembled slightly as he returned to the bench, but his voice remained steady. He knew this moment was bigger than his own pain. It was about justice, not revenge. As the next testimonies proceeded, Elijah asked sharp, concise questions, each word feeling like it weighed a ton on his tongue. Cargill stood at the back of the room, pretending nothing had happened. As if past and present were separate worlds he could walk between freely. Elijah stared at him for a long second, unflinching. It wasn't pure rage in his eyes. It was something heavier. Disappointment burned deep into his gut like molten iron. When the hearing finally ended, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Elijah thanked the participants with his usual formality. But inside, something had shifted forever. It was no longer just about the humiliation he had endured that morning. It was about a stolen legacy, an erased story, a brother who had cried out for justice and had been silenced. And now Elijah knew he could not stay silent any longer. The sound of rain hammered against the courthouse roof like a memory that refused to fade. Elijah looked out at those present, attorneys, assistants, defendants, guards, each face carrying its own story, its own scars. Yet, in that moment, he knew the most exposed wound in the room was his. With a steady hand, he called the first case on the docket. The formality of the law became his armor, something he wore expertly even as his heart pounded out of rhythm in his chest. During a pause between cases, a document slipped from the rushed stack of papers. Elijah bent down to retrieve it, and as he flipped through it quickly, his eyes froze on a marked page. Operation Vanguard, 2015. Brian Cargill's name was stamped at the top as the operations leader. The operation that, according to official records, had resulted in the death of a young man named Elijah Baptiste. Rico, his brother. The blood he had sworn to honor and protect, even after the war. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to keep the pain from breaking through. But it was too late. The past surged forward like a violent tide. The news of Rico's death arriving in a rain-soaked envelope. The silent, almost secret burial. The investigation that led nowhere. It all made sense now. Cargill wasn't just today's aggressor. He was the ghost from Elijah's past he had never confronted. Elijah's hand trembled slightly as he returned to the bench, but his voice remained steady. He knew this moment was bigger than his own pain. It was about justice, not revenge. As the next testimonies proceeded, Elijah asked sharp, concise questions, each word feeling like it weighed a ton on his tongue. Cargill stood at the back of the room, pretending nothing had happened. As if past and present were separate worlds he could walk between freely. Elijah stared at him for a long second, unflinching. It wasn't pure rage in his eyes. It was something heavier. Disappointment burned deep into his gut like molten iron. When the hearing finally ended, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Elijah thanked the participants with his usual formality. But inside, something had shifted forever. It was no longer just about the humiliation he had endured that morning. It was about a stolen legacy. An erased story. A brother who had cried out for justice and had been silenced. And now Elijah knew. He could not stay silent any longer. The first images surfaced quietly, like embers in the middle of a storm. Tasha Young, her hands still trembling, sent the video of the assault to a small community group. Within an hour, the footage was circulating across social media, slipping into muted headlines and whispers of outrage. Elijah walked the wet streets of Newark, his coat clinging to his body, trying to breathe through the flood of memories. Every black face that passed him seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. Stories that looked a lot like his own. He reached the Resurrection Baptist Church without even realizing the path he had taken. The door was ajar, and the muffled sound of a choir rehearsal filled the space with a heavy, comforting melancholy. Pastor Miriam, a woman with deep eyes and a soft voice, waited for him near the altar. No questions, no judgment, just presence. Elijah knelt at one of the empty pews and let the silence speak for him. The worn wood under his knees, the scent of extinguished candles, the timid warmth from the stained glass window, everything seemed to say, "You're still here." Pastor Miriam approached and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They shaved your hair, son, but they didn't erase your roots." Elijah shut his eyes tightly, as if holding back a scream buried deep in his chest. It was true. The strands could be stripped away. The promise could be violated. But what moved him, the silent faith, the love for his community, the memory of Rico, the hope Jean-Luc embodied, remained untouched. Invisible, maybe, but alive. Outside the church, a group of young people from the community waited for him. Some he knew from outreach projects, others only by sight. They carried cell phones, hastily made posters, and voices desperate to be heard. "I got stopped too. My sister was assaulted during intake. My dad never even got to file a complaint." The stories burst forth like muffled grenades. And Elijah, still bleeding inside, realized his pain wasn't an isolated case. It was the tip of a rotting iceberg, fed by decades of impunity. He looked up. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but a timid shaft of light was breaking through the gray. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough to start a silent revolution. The makeshift office at the Haiti Roots Community Center smelled of old paper and cold coffee. Elijah sat at the worn wooden desk, surrounded by piles of aged documents, torn folders, and letters yellowed by time. The silence in that room was thick, almost sacred. Each sheet he unfolded carried forgotten complaints, archived grievances, testimonies smothered by a bureaucracy designed more to shield than to correct. He jotted down dates, names, patterns. The history of violence wasn't new. It was a web meticulously crafted to remain invisible. Among the papers, Elijah found a dossier marked with a red star, the symbol some volunteers used for lost cases. Inside were internal court reports, mild warnings issued to Cargill and other officers, all conveniently buried. Every line he read felt like a fresh stab, not just for what had happened to him, but because the system devoured entire generations, crushing voices before they had a chance to rise. The legacy that should have been a source of pride, resilience, history, community, had been stolen. Not with screams, but with silence. Then, buried among a folder of old clippings, he found something that shattered his steel composure. A folded letter sealed from Miami. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Jean-Luc, the cousin who had survived cancer, the one Elijah had promised 3 years of dreads for. The letter spoke of gratitude, of victory over illness, and of hope, that together, they could build something greater for the young people of Haiti roots. At the end, Jean-Luc had written a single line, almost like a premonition. If one day they strip your strands, may they never strip your roots. Elijah felt his stomach sink. The promise had been broken, but not betrayed. Because its essence, faith, resilience, courage, was still alive, pulsing through every choice he made. The tears came silently, without warning, and he let them fall. For the first time in a long time, he cried not from weakness, but from renewal. That night, Elijah opened a new file on the center's computer. He named it without hesitation, Proposal for Institutional Conduct Reform, Essex District Courthouse. It was just a draft, a spark. But sometimes, a spark is all it takes to set the darkness ablaze. The Essex District Courthouse was packed. There was something different in the air that morning, as if the very structure of the building knew that this wasn't just another session. Elijah walked through the main entrance, no longer hiding his shaved head, no longer disguising the invisible scar he now wore like a badge of honor. The wooden crucifix tapped quietly against his chest with every step. At the makeshift defendant's table, Brian Cargill nervously adjusted his belt, his face paler than usual. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't in control of the script. Judge Ronald Everett took the bench with his usual posture of sternness. But there was something different in his eyes, a contained gravity, the look of a man who understood the true weight of what was about to be unearthed. Elijah was called as the main witness. As he climbed the steps to the stand, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Hopeful eyes, weary eyes, eyes of people who had never been allowed to speak. He took a deep breath. He began his testimony not with fiery accusations, but with facts. Cold, documented, irrefutable. He presented the evidence, Tasha's video, the buried reports, the witness statements gathered over the past few weeks. Each piece was a hammer blow against the wall of protection Cargill had believed to be unbreakable. When Elijah finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Then Cargill was called to defend himself. He tried to downplay the abuses, claimed protocol, institutional security, misinterpretation of facts. But every word rang hollow, distant, incompatible with the footage playing on the courtroom screen. The cracks began to show, even on the faces of his own colleagues. Tasha and other witnesses took the stand. Young, old, mothers, veterans. Each story added weight to the scales. Each testimony confirmed that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was an entire system, rotting from within. In his final statement, Elijah didn't ask for revenge. He asked for something much harder, accountability. Justice isn't about revenge, he said, looking straight at the judge. It's about acknowledgement. And without acknowledgement, there's no healing. Judge Everett's gavel struck the bench with force. A formal investigation was launched. Immediate suspension of Brian Cargill. It was just the beginning. But sometimes, a beginning is all a people need to rise. The sun was beginning to set over Newark, casting a golden hue across the worn facades of the neighborhood where it all began. In the courtyard of the community clinic, young people gathered, holding colorful signs, drawings of roots, raised fists, words like faith, healing, promise. Elijah Baptiste sat in front of an improvised mirror, a simple chair balanced on cracked concrete. In his hands, he held a small pair of scissors. There were no official cameras, no audience, only the community, the true legacy he wanted to preserve. With slow, almost ceremonial movements, Elijah shaved away the last remnants of the hair that had been forcibly taken from him. But this time, the choice was his. Each stroke of the blade was a silent affirmation of freedom. A small boy, with short dreads and a wide smile, approached him. He looked up at Elijah with admiration and whispered, "You are our root." Elijah smiled, a smile that didn't ask for permission to exist, a smile that carried pain, hope, and transformation all at once. When he finished, he rose and faced the horizon. The wind blew strong, carrying the scent of wet earth and ancient promises. Elijah ran his hand over his shaved head, feeling the coolness of exposed skin. It was vulnerability, yes, but it was also renewed strength. He was no longer the same man who had entered that courthouse with his head high and his heart wounded. He was something new, something neither the system, nor humiliation, nor pain could destroy. In the distance, Haitian drums began to sound, coming from the small community square where the choir was rehearsing. Each beat was like an ancestral call, a reminder that true roots cannot be ripped away, they only grow deeper. Elijah walked slowly to the sidewalk where the young people were gathering. There were no speeches, no manifestos. There was simply presence. A presence that said, "We are alive, and we are many." And sometimes, to exist, to resist, and to bloom silently is the greatest act of courage one can offer the world. What happened to Elijah Baptiste wasn't just an assault. It was a brutal reminder of how many still carry invisible scars, fighting silent battles every single day. But it was also a seed planted in barren soil. A seed that, even when trampled, refused to die. Because some pains break us, and some pains build us. Elijah chose the latter. He didn't allow humiliation to define who he was. He chose to turn his wound into testimony, his loss into legacy, his silence into presence. And today, his footsteps echo not just in Newark, but everywhere someone decides not to stay silent. Everywhere someone chooses to believe their story deserves to be told. Now, looking at your own life, what scars have you been hiding? What old promises still live in your heart, waiting for a new rebirth? How many times have you let your roots be cut, thinking it was impossible to start over? Maybe the answer isn't in fighting louder, but in standing deeper. Maybe your greatest strength lies precisely in what they tried to tear away from you. Because in the end, what truly matters cannot be erased by a blade, a humiliation, or a loss. Only you can decide what blooms from your pain. Only you can decide the legacy you leave behind. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because sometimes, a story doesn't change the entire world, but it changes someone's world forever.